In the blinding, sun-bleached expanse of the Libyan desert in 1943, a B-24 Liberator bomber, on a top-secret mission to transport a priceless cargo, vanished into a phantom sandstorm. The official report from the Army Air Forces was brief and conclusive. The plane and its 10-man crew were lost to the storm, swallowed by the vast and unforgiving Sand Sea of Calanscio. For 15 years, that was the story, a clean, tragic, and accepted casualty of war, leaving a family in Ohio with a hero's memory and a grave of empty air. Then, in 1958, a British oil survey team, flying low over a stretch of desert that had been unmapped by modern man, saw an impossible sight: a nearly intact World War II bomber sitting perfectly on the sand, as if it had landed only yesterday. The discovery of the ghost plane resurrected a long-dead case and launched a modern military investigation into a 15-year-old mystery. The subsequent forensic excavation of the perfectly preserved aircraft would uncover a truth far darker than any storm. A smashed radio, a single gold bar, a bullet hole in the pilot's seat, and a dead man's frantic diary would reveal that the crew of the B-24 were not the victims of an accident, but of a cold-blooded mutiny and a high-stakes gold heist. A perfect crime that was punished not by the laws of man, but by the slow, merciless justice of the desert itself. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, the air at the captured Axis airfield near Benghazi was a gritty, shimmering curtain of heat, dust, and the smell of aviation fuel. Captain Daniel Reeves, his flight cap pulled low to shield his eyes from the relentless Libyan sun, conducted his final walk-around of the B-24 Liberator, his boots crunching on the hard-packed sand. The plane, a hulking slab-sided beast nicknamed the Sandpiper, was his responsibility, his command, his home in the sky. At 28, Reeves was a man of quiet, almost severe, integrity. A pilot from the flat, orderly farmlands of Ohio who believed in the clear, moral geometry of the war. They were the good guys. The Axis was evil. His job was to fly his plane, protect his crew, and do his part to restore order to a world gone mad. His mission today, however, was a deviation from the usual violent rhythm of the air war. It was a transport flight, a top-secret, high-priority run to Cairo. The cargo, which had been loaded under the watchful, nervous eyes of a contingent of armed military police, was listed on his manifest as several crates of sensitive medical supplies. But Reeves, a man who noticed details, was suspicious. Medical supplies were not typically guarded by men with submachine guns, nor were they packed in crates so heavy they made his B-24 feel sluggish and overweight. His co-pilot, First Lieutenant Robbie Gallagher, ambled over, a cocky, confident swagger in his step that was pure Boston. Gallagher was everything Reeves was not. Charming, cynical. A man who seemed to treat the war as a grand, dangerous adventure, a high-stakes poker game. He was a superb pilot, fearless and intuitive, but there was a recklessness to him that always put Reeves on edge. "Looks like we're flying the Fort Knox Express today, Skipper," Gallagher said with a grin, nodding towards the armed guards who stood sweating in the shade of the wing. "I bet those boxes are full of something a little shinier than penicillin." "Our job isn't to bet, Robbie," Reeves replied, his voice a flat, professional monotone as he checked the tires on the landing gear. "Our job is to fly the plane and follow orders. Always by the book, Dan. That's why they love you." Gallagher laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "But a man can dream, can't he? Imagine what's in there. Gold, art, the Führer's personal stash of brandy. Whatever it is, it's worth more than our lives." Reeves didn't reply. He had handpicked his 10-man crew for their skill and professionalism, but he had inherited Gallagher as his co-pilot. He trusted the man's hands on the controls, but he had never fully trusted the man himself. There was a moral looseness to Gallagher, a cynicism that felt dangerous in a world where a man's character was the only thing that stood between life and death. They boarded the plane, the interior a sweltering metal oven. Reeves settled into the pilot's seat, the familiar feel of the worn leather, a small comfort. He began the pre-flight checklist, his voice a calm, steady litany, the responses from his crew a familiar, reassuring chorus. He looked over at Gallagher, who was casually flipping through a tattered copy of a men's adventure magazine, his feet propped up on the instrument panel. "Feet off the dash, Lieutenant," Reeves said, his voice sharp. Gallagher just grinned, slowly lowering his feet. "Whatever you say, Skipper." The 4 massive radial engines coughed to life, one by one, their roar, a welcome, familiar sound that drowned out the quiet tension in the cockpit. Reeves taxied the heavy, overloaded bomber to the end of the makeshift runway, the plane groaning under the weight of its secret. He received his clearance, pushed the throttles forward, and the Sandpiper began its ponderous, rumbling journey down the runway. It lifted off into the blinding white sky, a silver cross over the vast, empty canvas of the Libyan desert, its shadow a fleeting, dark specter on the endless dunes below. The flight eastward was a study in hypnotic, brutal monotony. Below them, the Libyan desert stretched to the horizon in every direction, a vast, featureless ocean of sand, its waves and ripples sculpted by a wind that had not stopped blowing since the dawn of time. The B-24 Liberator was a tiny, insignificant speck in an immense, indifferent world. Its 4 engines a lonely, droning sound in the vast, silent sky. Inside the cockpit, Captain Daniel Reeves held the plane on its course, his eyes in a constant, disciplined rotation, from the shimmering, heat-distorted horizon to the vital, life-sustaining gauges of the instrument panel. Oil pressure, cylinder head temperature, fuel flow, he was a master of his machine, a man who could feel a subtle change in the engine's harmony, a slight tremor in the airframe, with an almost preternatural sensitivity. His co-pilot, Robbie Gallagher, was a picture of bored nonchalance. He had taken over the controls for a spell, and he flew with a kind of lazy, intuitive grace, one hand resting lightly on the yoke, his head leaned back against the seat. But his eyes, which Reeves could see in the reflection of the cockpit glass, were not on the instruments. They were darting, watchful, occasionally glancing back into the fuselage, towards the cargo hold, where their secret, heavy treasure was stored. The POV shifts to the interior of the aircraft, a cramped, vibrating aluminum tube where 9 other men performed their duties. The navigator, a quiet, studious young man, worked at his small table, his maps and slide rules a small island of order in the chaotic, vibrating world. The radio operator sat at his station, listening to the quiet hiss of the ether, his ears attuned to the faint, distant voices of other planes, other bases. In the waist gunner positions, 2 young sergeants stared out at the endless, empty sky, their .50 caliber machine guns silent and cold. The atmosphere on the plane was tense. The secret nature of their cargo had created a quiet, unspoken current of speculation and unease among the crew. They were flying a bomber with no bombs, over a stretch of desert where there was no enemy, to deliver a cargo that was guarded with a level of security they had never seen before. They were not just a flight crew, they were the guards of a mystery. The first sign of trouble came without warning. A dark, ominous line appeared on the horizon to the south. It was not a cloud. It was a wall of sand, a haboob, a monstrous, churning wall of dust and wind that was moving across the desert with an incredible, terrifying speed. "What the hell is that?" Gallagher said, his voice losing its lazy drawl for the first time. "Sandstorm," Reeves said, his voice tight, his hands already taking back control of the plane. "A big one. Radio, get me a weather update from Cairo now." But it was too late. The storm was on them in minutes, a biblical, roiling cloud of sand that swallowed the sky and plunged the world into a murky twilight gloom. The turbulence was instantaneous and violent. The B-24, a massive 20-ton machine, was tossed about like a leaf, the sandblasting of the wind on its metal skin, a deafening, continuous roar. And then, the second alarm. The oil pressure gauge for the number 3 engine, the inboard engine on the right wing, began to drop erratically. A red light flashed on the instrument panel, "We're losing oil pressure on number 3. Reeves yelled over the roar of the storm. "The sand must have gotten into the intake. I'm feathering it." He reached up and pulled the propeller control for the failing engine, turning the blades into the wind to reduce drag. The plane yawed violently, now flying on only 3 engines. It was then that the radio operator's voice crackled over the intercom, a frantic, desperate shout broken by static. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Army Air Force flight. Engine failure, caught in severe sandstorm. We are..." The message cut out. In the cockpit, a new, more terrifying alarm began to scream. The number 2 engine, the inboard engine on the left wing, was now failing as well. The plane, having lost both of its critical inboard engines, began to lose altitude at a terrifying rate. "We're going down!" Gallagher yelled, his face a mask of pale, raw terror. Reeves didn't reply. He was fighting the controls, his entire body straining to keep the dying aircraft level, to give his crew a chance, however slim, of surviving a crash landing in the heart of the merciless, storm-racked desert. The last thing the radio operator at the Cairo base heard was the single, chilling, and final sound of a stall warning horn, a continuous, high-pitched scream that was abruptly cut off by an all-consuming wall of static. The abrupt, terrifying silence from the Sandpiper sent a ripple of alarm through the command structure of the 9th Air Force in Cairo. A B-24 Liberator, one of the most rugged and reliable aircraft in the inventory, had simply vanished from the sky. The subsequent search and rescue operation was a logistical nightmare, an exercise in profound futility. The POV shifts to the sterile, map-lined operations room in Cairo, where a weary, overworked colonel is faced with an impossible task. The bomber's last known position was a vague, uncertain point in the middle of the Calanscio Sand Sea, a vast, trackless wilderness of shifting dunes and desolate, rocky plains larger than the state of Texas. The search was launched, but it was a token effort, a gesture against the overwhelming scale of the desert. A few long-range B-25s were dispatched to fly grid patterns over the suspected crash area. Their pilots and observers stared down at a landscape of mesmerizing, monotonous, and soul-crushing emptiness. The desert was a perfect, sandy shroud. A crashed plane would be swallowed by the shifting dunes in a matter of hours, leaving no trace, no wreckage, no oil slick, no smoke. After 3 days of fruitless searching, with the operational demands of a real war pressing in, the search was officially called off. The Board of Inquiry was a swift, perfunctory affair. The evidence was thin, but it all pointed to a single logical conclusion. The last, frantic radio message from the plane had spoken of a severe sandstorm and catastrophic engine failure. The conclusion was self-evident. The official accident report, filed a week later, was a clean, tragic, and definitive document. It concluded that the B-24 Liberator, flight designation unknown, had encountered an unexpectedly violent and severe sandstorm. The abrasive, sand-filled air had caused the catastrophic failure of at least 2 of the aircraft's 4 engines, leading to a loss of control and a subsequent crash in an unrecoverable location. The 10-man crew, led by Captain Daniel Reeves, was declared killed in the line of duty, their bodies and their aircraft lost forever to the desert. The report was a perfect, self-contained narrative. It was a story of brave men and a powerful, unpredictable machine being overwhelmed by the even more powerful and unpredictable forces of nature. It was a story with no villains, no mistakes, only the tragic, unavoidable hand of fate. The secret, heavy cargo the plane had been carrying was mentioned only in a classified addendum, its loss written off as an unfortunate but acceptable cost of war. The families of the 10 crewmen were notified by telegram, their personal tragedies absorbed into the vast, anonymous grief of a world at war. The file on the Sandpiper was stamped closed and sent to the archives, another ghost in the vast, haunted skies of the North African campaign. 15 years. For David Reeves, the 15 years since his brother's plane had vanished were a long, slow, and quiet ache. In 1943, he had been an 18-year-old high school student in Ohio, a boy who had looked at his older brother, the handsome, heroic bomber pilot, with a kind of pure, unadulterated adoration. Daniel had been everything he wasn't. Confident, disciplined, a man of action who was fighting a great and noble war. Now, in the prosperous, forward-looking America of 1958, David was a young journalist at a small, local newspaper. He was a man of words, of questions, of a quiet, persistent skepticism that was the core of his trade. He had lived a life that his brother had never had the chance to. He had gone to college, had gotten married, had a young daughter of his own. But the ghost of his brother, and the ghost of his brother's plane, had never left him. The official story, the lost in the storm theory, had never felt right. It was too neat, too simple. Daniel, as he remembered him, was not a man to be easily defeated. He was a meticulous, almost obsessive pilot, a man who had a deep, intuitive understanding of his aircraft. The idea that he had simply been swatted from the sky by a storm felt like a disservice to his skill, an incomplete and unsatisfying epitaph. His obsession was a quiet one, a private investigation conducted in the dusty archives of libraries and the quiet of his own study late at night. As part of a long-form journalism project, he had begun researching the stories of the many ghost planes of the North African campaign, the hundreds of Allied and Axis aircraft that had been lost without a trace in the vast emptiness of the Sahara. He had spent years collecting books, reading declassified military reports, and even corresponding with other families who had lost loved ones in the desert. He had become an amateur expert on the B-24 Liberator, on the weather patterns of the Libyan desert, on the logistical challenges of the air war in North Africa. His research had only deepened his doubts. He had learned that the B-24 was a remarkably durable aircraft, a plane that was notoriously difficult to bring down. He had read accounts of crews who had nursed their heavily damaged bombers hundreds of miles back to base, their planes riddled with flak holes, with engines on fire. The idea that a simple sandstorm could cause a catastrophic, multi-engine failure on a well-maintained aircraft seemed less and less likely the more he learned. He was haunted by the lack of any wreckage. The desert, while vast, was not a complete void. Other lost planes had been found over the years, their skeletons discovered by Bedouin tribesmen or oil prospectors. But of the Sandpiper, there had never been a single solitary trace. It was as if it had flown into a hole in the world. His family, his parents who had passed away a few years ago, his wife, they had all made their peace with Daniel's death. They saw his continued research as a morbid, unhealthy refusal to let go. They didn't understand that it was not just about grief, it was about the truth. As a journalist, he believed that every story had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the story of his brother's final flight was a story with a missing last chapter. He had resigned himself to the fact that he would likely never find it. The desert was too vast, the time was too long, the trail was too cold. He was a man chasing a ghost, a man trying to solve a 15-year-old mystery from a desk in Ohio. He had accepted that the truth of what had happened to his brother was a secret that the desert would keep forever. The de Havilland Beaver was a small, single-engine bush plane, a rugged, reliable workhorse that was perfectly suited to the demands of the Libyan desert. From its cockpit, the two-man British Geological Survey team had a god's-eye view of the world below. Their mission was to conduct a low-altitude magnetic survey for a British oil company, a slow, methodical process of flying in precise grid patterns over a vast, unexplored concession deep in the heart of the Calanscio Sand Sea. The pilot, a former RAF officer named Alistair, was a man who had spent thousands of hours flying over this landscape. He was accustomed to its profound, almost hypnotic emptiness. The world below was a mesmerizing, unending canvas of sand, its color shifting from a pale, creamy white to a deep, burnt orange, its surface sculpted by the wind into vast, rolling dunes and sharp, knife-edged ridges. They had been in the air for 3 hours, the drone of the single radial engine a constant, lulling hum. The geologist in the co-pilot's seat, a young man named Peter, was monitoring the survey equipment, his eyes on the needles and gauges. Alistair was the one who saw it. He was flying at about 500 feet, his eyes in a constant practiced scan of the landscape. He saw a flash of light on the sand below, a glint of reflected sun that was too sharp, too metallic, to be natural. He banked the small plane, circling back for a closer look. "Peter, take a look at this," he said, his voice a low, puzzled murmur over the intercom. Peter looked up from his instruments and followed Alistair's gaze. And there, in the middle of a vast, flat, empty expanse between two massive dunes, was the impossible. It was an airplane. A massive, four-engine bomber, sitting perfectly upright on the sand, its silver skin gleaming in the harsh desert sun. It was not a wreck. It was intact, as if it had been gently placed there by a giant hand. A stunned, disbelieving silence filled the cockpit. They were hundreds of miles from any known airfield, in a part of the world that had not been mapped since World War II. They circled the site again, lower this time. It was an American B-24 Liberator, its iconic twin-tail design unmistakable. It was a ghost from another era, a relic of a war that had ended more than a decade ago. The plane was in an incredible state of preservation. The dry, sterile desert air had protected it from the ravages of rust and decay. The tires on its landing gear were still inflated. The glass in the cockpit and the gun turrets was unbroken. It was a perfect, silent, and deeply eerie time capsule. Alistair grabbed the radio microphone. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!" he said, his voice tight with a mixture of excitement and awe. "This is Survey Flight Golf Bravo Charlie. We have discovered what appears to be a fully intact World War II bomber in the desert. Repeat, a fully intact bomber." He read out their GPS coordinates. The discovery of the ghost plane became an international news story overnight. The images, taken by Alistair and Peter, were published in newspapers around the world. A perfectly preserved bomber, sitting silently in the heart of the Sahara, was a story of irresistible romantic mystery. In a small town in Ohio, a young journalist named David Reeves saw the photograph on the front page of his newspaper. He stared at the image of the B-24, at its familiar hulking shape, and felt a jolt of recognition so profound it was like a physical blow. He did not know for certain that it was his brother's plane. But in his gut, in the place where he had kept his brother's memory alive for 15 years, he knew the ghost had finally appeared. The discovery of the ghost plane in the Libyan desert triggered a complex, multinational diplomatic and military response. The plane was an American military asset, discovered by a British survey team on Libyan soil. After weeks of negotiation, a joint US-UK recovery mission was approved. The American component of the mission was led by the US Air Force's Mortuary Affairs and Accident Investigation Branch. The man chosen to lead the American team was Major Thomas Griffin. Griffin was a sharp, methodical investigator in his early 40s, a man who had made a career out of sifting through the cold, often tragic, wreckage of the past. He was an expert in aircraft accident reconstruction, a detective whose witnesses were twisted metal and faded logbooks. He arrived at the site via a C-47 transport plane that landed on a hastily prepared desert airstrip a few miles from the wreck. The scene that greeted him was even more incredible than the photographs had suggested. The B-24 Liberator, which the press had nicknamed the Lady of the Dunes, sat on the hard-packed sand, a silent, majestic monument to a bygone era. The desert winds had scoured its silver, unpainted aluminum skin to a dull, polished sheen. It was a place of profound, almost religious, silence. Major Griffin's first act was to establish a formal, military-style base camp, a small, self-sufficient island of order in the vast, chaotic emptiness of the desert. The site was declared a sealed military investigation zone. His team, a mix of aircraft mechanics, forensic specialists, and mortuary affairs officers, began their work with a slow, painstaking precision. The first, and most baffling, mystery was the state of the plane itself. It was not a crash site. It was a landing site. The plane was resting on its belly. Its landing gear retracted. The propellers were not bent or shattered from a crash, but were perfectly straight, indicating the engines had been shut down before the landing. The fuselage was almost completely intact, with only minor damage to its underside from the belly landing on the sand. This was not the scene of a plane that had been lost in a storm. This was the scene of a plane that had been deliberately and skillfully landed in the middle of nowhere. The second mystery was even more profound. The plane was completely, utterly empty. The crew's hatches were open. A rope ladder was dangling from the rear hatch, but of the 10-man crew, there was no sign. They had vanished. Griffin and his team began a meticulous, inch-by-inch examination of the aircraft's interior. The preservation was astonishing. The dry desert air had mummified the contents. They found a thermos of coffee on the navigator's table that was still half full, the black liquid now a solid, petrified puck. They found logbooks, maps, and personal letters, their paper dry and brittle, but their ink still perfectly legible. They found flight jackets, neatly folded, and half-eaten sandwiches, now hard as rock. It was a place of everyday life, abruptly and inexplicably abandoned. The initial theory was a simple one. The crew had experienced a mechanical failure, had made a successful forced landing, and had then tried to walk out of the desert. It was a tragic, but heroic, story of survival against impossible odds. While his team worked on the plane, Griffin began his own historical investigation. He had the complete file on the missing crew, led by Captain Daniel Reeves. He spoke via a crackling, long-distance phone line with Daniel's younger brother, David, the journalist from Ohio. David told him of his brother's skill, of his professionalism, of his quiet integrity. He also told him of his own long-held doubts about the official lost in the storm theory. Griffin, a man who trusted evidence over stories, was beginning to share those doubts. The scene in the desert did not match the story in the files. The plane had not been lost to a storm. It had been landed. And the crew had not just vanished. They had walked away. The question was, why? And where had they gone? Major Thomas Griffin stood in the shadow of the B-24's massive wing, the desert sun beating down with a relentless, punishing force. For a week, he and his team had been engaged in a slow, methodical deconstruction of the ghost plane's secrets. The initial theory, a heroic crew surviving a forced landing and attempting to walk to safety, was a good story. But Griffin was not in the business of good stories. He was in the business of hard facts. And the facts, as they began to emerge from the perfectly preserved aircraft, were telling a different and far more sinister story. The first piece of evidence that fundamentally contradicted the heroic survival narrative came from the propellers. Griffin's lead mechanic, a grizzled master sergeant who had worked on B-24s during the war, made the critical observation. "Major, look at these props," he said, running a gloved hand over one of the massive blades. "They're feathered." The term was a technical one, but its implication was profound. Feathering a propeller meant turning the blades so that their thin edges were facing into the wind, a procedure used to reduce drag from a failed or shut-down engine. All 4 of the B-24's propellers were in the feathered position. "You don't feather all 4 props in an emergency landing," the sergeant explained. "You need power to control your descent. You only do this if you are shutting the engines down deliberately for a planned, controlled, dead-stick landing." The discovery was the first major pivot in the investigation. This was not a desperate last-minute emergency landing. This was a planned event. The crew had intentionally shut down their engines and had glided their massive 20-ton bomber to a remarkably smooth and controlled belly landing in the middle of the desert. The second, and even more damning, piece of evidence was discovered by the team's radio technician. He was examining the long-range radio set in the radio operator's compartment. The radio, the crew's only lifeline to the outside world, their only means of calling for help after their landing, was not just broken. It had been deliberately and professionally destroyed. The vacuum tubes had been smashed. The wiring had been cut with a pair of pliers. The destruction was not the result of a rough landing. It was a calculated act of sabotage. Someone on that plane had not wanted to be found. The investigation now had a new and deeply unsettling focus. This was not a story of survival. This was a story of desertion. The crew, or at least a faction of it, had faked a mechanical failure, had landed their plane in a pre-selected, remote location, and had intentionally vanished. Griffin and his team began to search the plane again, this time looking not for clues of an accident, but for evidence of a plan. They found it in the navigator's map case. Tucked away behind the official flight maps to Cairo was another, hand-drawn map. It was a crude but detailed map of a section of the Libyan desert, with a single red X marked in a remote, desolate valley. The coordinates of the X were a perfect match for the location of the ghost plane. The landing had not just been planned, it had been navigated. The theory of a heroic crew, lost to the desert, was now completely, utterly dead. It was replaced by a new and far darker narrative. A crew of mutineers had stolen a U.S. military aircraft, had landed it in a secret location, and had deserted their post in a time of war. The crime was one of the most serious in the military code of justice. But the central question remained: why? Why would a 10-man crew, men who had volunteered to fight for their country, commit such a desperate, high-stakes crime? The answer, Griffin was certain, was not in the plane itself. It was in the cargo that the plane had been carrying. With the fact of a deliberate, planned landing now firmly established, Major Thomas Griffin's investigation turned to the one remaining mystery: the cargo. The official manifest had listed the plane's contents as sensitive medical supplies. But the heavy armed guard at the airfield in Libya and the crew's desperate act of desertion suggested that the manifest was a lie. The cargo hold of the B-24 was in the center of the fuselage, a cavernous space that was now empty save for a few splintered wooden crates and some shredded packing material. The crates, which had once been sealed and heavy, were now smashed open, their contents gone. The initial theory that the crew had taken supplies for their trek through the desert seemed plausible, but Griffin, a man of meticulous detail, was not satisfied. He ordered his team to conduct a fingertip search of the entire cargo bay, to sift through every inch of the sand and debris that had blown into the aircraft over the past 15 years. It was a young airman, carefully brushing away the sand from a narrow gap between a floor plate and the fuselage wall, who found it. His brush struck something hard, something heavy, something that was not wood or metal from the plane. He carefully worked it free. It was a small, rectangular bar, about the size of a common brick, and it was incredibly, unnaturally heavy. Its surface was a dull, soft, yellow color, unstained by the years. The airman, a kid from rural Texas who had never seen such a thing in his life, called for the major. Griffin came over and knelt, taking the heavy bar in his gloved hands. He knew instantly what it was. He had seen bars like this before, in photographs from the U.S. Treasury vaults at Fort Knox. It was a standard issue, 28-pound gold bullion bar. The discovery of the gold bar was the second, and most profound, forensic pivot of the investigation. It was the key that unlocked the entire motive for the crime. This was not a simple case of desertion. This was a heist, a high-stakes, audacious, and brilliantly executed gold heist. The manifest had been a fiction, a piece of wartime camouflage. The plane had been secretly transporting a fortune in recovered Nazi gold, likely looted from the banks of Europe and captured by the Allies in the North African campaign. And a faction of the crew, led by the charismatic and cynical co-pilot, Robbie Gallagher, had decided to steal it for themselves. The entire bizarre story now made perfect criminal sense. The faked engine failure, the perfectly executed landing in a prearranged location, the smashed radio. It was all part of a plan to steal a fortune and vanish into the anonymity of the post-war world. Griffin and his team now searched the cargo bay with a new, feverish intensity. They found the imprints in the wooden crates where other, similar bars had been stored. They calculated the weight and the volume. The plane, they estimated, had been carrying at least 2 tons of gold, a fortune that in 1958 was worth millions of dollars, a sum that was almost beyond comprehension. The discovery of the gold transformed the investigation from a military inquiry into a major criminal case. The story of the ghost plane was no longer a romantic mystery of lost heroes. It was a story of mutiny, of greed, and of a crime that had been perfectly preserved in the desert for 15 years. But the discovery of the motive also created a new and even more profound mystery. If the crew had successfully stolen the gold, where were they? And where was the fortune they had killed for? The single, missed gold bar, which had been the key to solving the crime, was now the starting point of a new and far more tragic search. With the motive of the heist now firmly established, Major Thomas Griffin's investigation became a cold case homicide inquiry. The central question was no longer why the crew had landed in the desert, but what had happened in the final, violent moments of the flight. The key, he knew, was in the cockpit. He and his forensics team began a microscopic, inch-by-inch examination of the flight deck, a space that had been a silent, sun-baked tomb for 15 years. They were looking for the subtle, almost invisible, signs of a struggle, for the evidence of the mutiny that they now knew had taken place. They found it in the pilot station, the domain of the principled and by-the-book Captain Daniel Reeves. The team's ballistics expert, while examining the heavy armored plate behind the pilot's seat, found a small, gouged-out pucker in the steel. It was not a shrapnel hole. It was the impact point of a bullet, a .45 caliber round that had been stopped by the armor. Then, a forensic technician, sifting the sand and dust from the floor beneath the pilot's rudder pedals, found it. A single, spent .45 caliber shell casing, its brass surface a dull, greenish brown. The final, heartbreaking piece of evidence came from a chemical analysis of the worn leather seat cushion. Using a luminol spray, which reacts with the iron in hemoglobin, the team found what they were looking for. Under a black light, a large, ghostly, blue-white stain appeared on the seat. It was the chemical ghost of a massive blood stain, the residue of Captain Daniel Reeves's blood. The evidence told a clear, brutal, and tragic story. A firefight, or at least a gunshot, had taken place in the cockpit. Captain Reeves had been shot, likely from behind, by one of his own crewmen. He had been murdered at the controls of his own aircraft. The investigation now had a victim and a motive. The next step was to identify the killer. Griffin's focus narrowed immediately on the co-pilot, First Lieutenant Robbie Gallagher. He was the second in command, the man sitting next to Reeves, the man with the known cynical and reckless personality. Griffin began to build a psychological profile of the crew, based on the personal letters and diaries they had recovered from the wreckage. The writings of Captain Reeves and most of the crew were filled with the familiar sentiments of wartime, duty, honor, and a longing for home. But the letters of Robbie Gallagher and two other crewmen, the navigator and one of the waist gunners, told a different story. They were filled with a deep, corrosive cynicism, a resentment of the military brass, and a greedy, desperate desire for a life of wealth and ease. They were the words of men who saw the war not as a crusade, but as a rigged game, and they were determined to get their share. Griffin could now reconstruct the crime with a high degree of certainty. The conspiracy was limited to a small faction of the crew, led by Gallagher. Their plan was simple: fake a mechanical failure, kill the one man who would never go along with their plan, the incorruptible Captain Reeves, and then land the plane in the desert, where they would be met by an accomplice with a vehicle to transport the gold. The bullet hole in the seat, the spent casing, the bloodstain, it was all the evidence of a cold-blooded mutiny. Captain Daniel Reeves had not been a victim of a storm. He had been the sole honorable man on a flight of thieves, and he had been murdered for his integrity. The story of the ghost plane was no longer just a heist. It was a homicide. Major Thomas Griffin stood before a large map of the Libyan desert in his makeshift office at the base camp, a single, bare light bulb casting harsh shadows on his face. The pieces of the puzzle were all there, scattered on the table before him. The forensic reports, the photographs of the bullet hole, the translated letters of the crew. He was ready to construct the final, complete theory of the crime. A narrative that was a world away from the simple, heroic story of a lost bomber. He began with the conspiracy, a seed of greed planted in the cynical hearts of a few good men. The ringleader was, without a doubt, First Lieutenant Robbie Gallagher. His letters home were filled with a gambler's desperate, reckless energy, a hunger for a big score. He had likely recruited the navigator, a man who could create the false flight plan and find the secret landing spot, and the waist gunner, a tough, street-smart kid who would act as the muscle. Their target was the gold. They had likely learned of the secret transport flight through a contact at the Benghazi airfield and had seen it as the opportunity of a lifetime. Their plan was audacious, but in the chaos of the North African campaign, it was not impossible. "The flight begins as normal," Griffin narrated to his team, his voice a low, grim monotone. "Reeves is at the controls. Gallagher beside him. They are flying east, towards Cairo. But the navigator is not guiding them to Cairo. He is guiding them to a pre-selected, isolated spot in the deep desert, a place marked on his secret map. At the designated point, the mutiny begins. Gallagher's faction makes their move. Their first act is to fake the mechanical failure, to create the radio message that will provide the official cover story for their disappearance. The radio operator, likely not a part of the conspiracy, is forced at gunpoint to send the frantic, partial message about the sandstorm and the engine failure. But Captain Daniel Reeves is not a man to be easily fooled. He is an expert pilot. He knows his plane is not failing. He knows the storm is a phantom. He realizes, in a moment of shocking, terrible clarity, what is happening. He is in the middle of a mutiny. "This is the point of confrontation," Griffin continued, his finger tracing a line on the map. "Reeves refuses to cooperate. He is a man of unshakable integrity. He will not surrender his aircraft or his mission." A struggle ensues in the cockpit. Gallagher, or one of his co-conspirators, pulls his .45 caliber pistol. Reeves is shot. He is killed at the controls of his plane. With the captain dead, Gallagher takes command. He and the navigator execute the final phase of their plan. They feather the props, shut down the engines, and glide the massive silent bomber to a perfect, controlled belly landing at the red X on their secret map. They have done it. They have stolen a fortune in gold and an airplane and have vanished from the world. "Their plan is perfect," Griffin said. "They have landed in their secret spot. They have a fortune in gold, and they are waiting for their ride. An accomplice, likely a local black marketeer with a truck, is supposed to be waiting for them to transport them and the gold to a coastal port where they will disappear into the post-war underworld. But this is where the perfect crime begins to unravel. This is where the desert, the silent, indifferent stage for their crime, becomes an active, malevolent participant. The accomplice never shows up," Griffin concluded, his voice a low whisper. "For whatever reason, a broken-down truck, a failure of nerve, a double-cross their ride out of the desert is not there, and the crew of mutineers, the men who have just committed murder and treason for a fortune, are now stranded. They are alone, in the middle of the most unforgiving environment on Earth, with 2 tons of gold they cannot spend, and a supply of water that will only last them a few days. The perfect heist had just become a death sentence. The new theory of the crime was complete, a story of a perfect heist undone by a single fatal flaw. But it was still a theory, a narrative constructed from the physical evidence of the plane. Major Thomas Griffin needed something more. He needed a voice from the past, a first-hand account of the crew's final desperate days. He found it in the navigator's map case. Tucked away with the official flight charts and the secret hand-drawn map of the landing site was the navigator's personal logbook. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the neat, precise script of a man who dealt in numbers and coordinates. The early entries were routine, navigational calculations, weather observations, notes on landmarks, but the final entries, dated after the plane had landed, were the third and most profound pivot of the investigation. They were a frantic, desperate, and ultimately tragic chronicle of the crew's descent into a private, sun-scorched hell. The logbook was no longer a record of a flight. It was the diary of a dead man. The first entry after the landing was filled with a triumphant, arrogant confidence. "Landed perfectly. On the mark. Gallagher is a genius. Reeves is dead. The fool fought back. His share will be split. Waiting for our ride. Should be here by nightfall. Then, a new life. But the tone of the entries quickly changes. The second day's entry is laced with a growing anxiety. No sign of the truck. The sun is incredible. Water is already running low. Gallagher says to be patient. He says the man is reliable. The third day's entry is a descent into fear. He is not coming. The man is not coming. We are stranded. The crew is getting restless. The gold is a curse. It sits there, gleaming in the hold. We cannot eat it. We cannot drink it. The logbook then details the final, fatal decision. The crew, now in a state of open panic and dissent, decides to abandon the plane and the bulk of the gold. Their only hope is to walk north towards the coast, a journey of over 150 miles across a waterless, trackless wasteland. "We are walking," the navigator wrote, his handwriting becoming a shaky, almost illegible scrawl. "Each man is taking 1 bar of gold," Gallagher insisted. He says we did not come this far for nothing. It is madness. The bar is a weight. It is an anchor. The water will be gone by tomorrow. The final entry in the logbook was a single desperate sentence, a final compass heading scrawled on the page. Walking north. God help us. The navigator's log was the final, missing chapter of the story. It was a first-hand confession of the mutiny, the murder, and the heist, and it was a map. It provided the investigators with the one crucial piece of information they needed to solve the final mystery of the ghost plane, the direction in which the crew had walked to their deaths. Griffin now knew the whole terrible story. The crew of thieves had gotten their fortune, but the desert, in an act of profound poetic justice, had presented them with a bill, and the price was their lives. The investigation was no longer about a crime. It was now a recovery mission. A search for the bodies of 9 men who had been lost not to a storm, but to their own greed. The navigator's final, desperate entry was a compass heading into oblivion, but for Major Thomas Griffin, it was a clear and direct order. The final phase of the investigation would be a ground search, a grim, historical reenactment of the crew's death march. Griffin assembled a small, mobile team. They would use 2 World War II-era jeeps, vehicles that could handle the treacherous, sandy terrain. They were equipped with long-range radios, emergency supplies, and a military-grade sun compass for navigation. Their mission was to follow the navigator's heading, walking north from the ghost plane, and to find what the desert had claimed 15 years ago. They set out at dawn. The 2 jeeps, a small, anachronistic convoy moving across the vast, silent emptiness of the Sand Sea. The landscape was a mesmerizing, terrifying world of endless, rolling dunes. The sand so fine it was like red flour. The heat was a physical presence, a crushing, suffocating weight. For the first day, they found nothing. The desert was a blank, empty page. But on the morning of the second day, about 20 miles north of the plane, they found the first sign. It was a single leather flying boot, half buried in the sand, its leather cracked and bleached by the sun. This was the beginning of the trail. From that point on, the discoveries came with a grim, tragic regularity. A few miles further on, they found the first body. It was a mummified corpse, perfectly preserved by the dry, sterile air. Its wool uniform still largely intact, its skin the color and texture of old leather. It was one of the enlisted men, lying on his back, his empty canteen still clutched in his hand. Over the next 2 days, they found 4 more bodies, scattered over a distance of about 30 miles. They were the remains of the younger, less experienced crewmen, men who had succumbed quickly to the brutal, waterless reality of the desert. Each man was a silent, tragic tableau of a slow, agonizing death. They continued north, following the trail of the stronger, more determined survivors. On the 4th day, they found the next group of 3 bodies, including the navigator, huddled together in the scant shade of a small rock outcropping. The navigator's logbook was still in his pocket. He had documented their final days, his neat script devolving into a mad, desperate scrawl, a record of a descent into dehydration, delirium, and despair. Now, there was only one man left. The ringleader. The man whose greed had orchestrated this entire tragedy. Robbie Gallagher. They found him on the 5th day, nearly 80 miles from the plane. He had made it further than any of the others, a testament to his own ruthless, selfish will to survive. His mummified body was lying at the base of a massive sand dune, his arms outstretched as if reaching for a phantom oasis. And next to his body, half buried in the sand, its yellow surface gleaming dully in the sun, was a single, heavy, 28-pound gold bar. The sight was a perfect, chilling, and poetic final image. Gallagher, even in his final delirious moments, had refused to abandon his prize. He had carried the useless, heavy anchor of his own greed to his death, a fortune he could not spend, a weight that had only hastened his demise. The search was over. All 9 of the mutineers had been found. The desert had served as both the stage for their crime and the instrument of their execution. It had given them the fortune they had killed for. And then it had presented them with a bill that could only be paid in lives. The recovery of the crew of the Sandpiper and the full, sordid story of the mutiny and the heist was a quiet, internal matter for the U.S. Air Force. The official story, when it was finally released to the public, was a heavily redacted and sanitized version of the truth. It stated that the wreckage of the long-lost B-24 had been found, and that the crew, after a heroic forced landing, had tragically perished while trying to walk to safety. There was no mention of a murder, of a mutiny, or of gold. The honor of the service and the memory of the war required a simpler, cleaner story. But for Major Thomas Griffin and for David Reeves, the truth was what mattered. The final act of the investigation took place not in the desert, but in a quiet, sunlit living room in a small town in Ohio. Major Griffin had flown from Libya to personally deliver his findings to the one person who had kept the faith for 15 years. He sat with David, who was now a man in his early 30s, a respected journalist with a family of his own. Griffin laid out the entire, incredible story. He told him of the planned landing, of the smashed radio, of the gold. He showed him the photographs of the bullet hole in his brother's seat, and he read him the final, heroic account of his resistance from the navigator's own diary. He told David that his brother, Captain Daniel Reeves, had not been a victim of a storm. He had died a hero, the only man on a flight of thieves who had held to his duty, who had tried to stop a mutiny, who had given his life to protect his mission. David Reeves listened, the story he had suspected for 15 years finally being given voice. The truth, finally, blessedly, being excavated from the sands of time. The grief for his lost brother was still there, a permanent part of him. But it was now joined by a profound, cleansing sense of pride. The cheap, easy story of an accident was gone, replaced by a complex, tragic, and heroic truth. His brother had not been lost. He had been betrayed, and he had died fighting. Griffin then handed him a small, flag-draped box. Inside were his brother's dog tags, recovered from the cockpit, polished and clean. It was the only part of him that had ever come home. The story ends with David Reeves, a few weeks later, at his typewriter. He is a journalist, a man whose trade is the telling of stories, and he is beginning to write the most important story of his life. It is not a story for his newspaper. It is a story for his children and for their children. It is the true story of their great-uncle, Captain Daniel Reeves. It is a story of a hero, a story of a ghost plane in the desert, a story of a fortune in gold, and a story of how, sometimes, the desert itself delivers a final and perfect justice.